and part of MoneyLab of Berlin. I'm very excited to be here with my co-panelists today, Sarah Friend, Matt Dryhurst, and Wassim Alsindi. I'll introduce everyone first, and then we can get started with our conversation. So, Sarah Friend is an artist and software engineer specializing in blockchain and the peer-to-peer web. She's a participant in the Berlin Program for Artists, a co-curator of Ender Gallery, an artist residency taking place inside the game Minecraft, an alumni of the Curve Center, and an organizer of Our Networks, a conference on all aspects of the distributed web. For the past 2 years, she has been working on Circles UBI, a peer-to-peer community currency that acts like a universal basic income. It was launched to the public in October 2020 in Berlin. Her recent exhibitions include the Crypto Manifold at the Kronos House Center in Shanghai, Screensaver Watching Us at On-Site Project, New Tech SF Nexus in San Francisco, and the Art of No Likes residency at Arby Gallery in London.
Thank you, Laura.
And we have Matt Dryhurst, mixed art in Berlin. He teaches at NYU's Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music and is co-host of the Interdependence podcast. And we have Wassim Alsindi is the founder and host of the Xerox Salon, conducting experiments in post-disciplinary collective knowledge practices involved in discourse, art, and writing. He works on conceptual design and philosophy of token economies and cryptocurrencies, in addition to writing and editorial responsibilities at publications including the MIT Computational Journal. Previously, Wassim co-founded MIT's Crypto Economic Systems Journal and Conference Series, and developed novel characterization approaches for crypto assets and networks, such as the regulatory epistemology project, Token Space. And then there's me, Laura Lotti. Hi. I'm a researcher investigating the affordances of blockchains for alternative forms of organizing, particularly looking at the relation between economic and social aspects. I'm a member of Trust, and I'm a co-founder of Black Swan with Penny Rafferty and Tony Bowden, and I'm also a friend and collaborator of The Sphere, both of which Black Swan and The Sphere are going to present later today. So I'd like to mention for our MoneyLab participants. So thank you everyone for being here. Before starting our conversation on the potential and drawbacks of social tokens and unravel some of the tensions between incentives and valuation, access and exclusion, and community versus public interest. I want to introduce a little token game that we're going to do today. So all our participants from Twitch will be able to tip tokens to us panelists by typing in the chat our name and just our names, yes. So each viewer will have 50 tokens total, and so use them as you please in this game. Just a way to try out or begin illustrating some of these tensions and experiencing them also ourselves as we go.
And what's funny is if you put my name in, you get a token yourself.
Now everyone can know what it feels like to print their own money.
Exactly. Okay, so I guess we can begin. Why social tokens? I'm going to start with asking a question to Matt and opening up the conversation. So I was wondering, Matt, from your perspective, being really involved in a lot of these digital communities, what is the need for social tokens in these communities and how that relates to larger needs within the ecosystem?
It's a good question, right? To qualify what a social token is, maybe first, is that a good idea?
I think so, yes.
It's quite difficult, obviously, because a lot of tokens have social components connected to them. It's not that easy to disentangle the social from the standard deployment of an ERC20 token, which is supporting a project and then the promise that in return you're getting back this strange token that represents stake in governance in some cases, and also a piece of equity that you could potentially sell for profit in future.
Yeah.
The social or community token space generally seems to have been kind of defined as tokens that aren't in support necessarily of a particular like company or new protocol, but instead like a an art practice or an individual, something along those lines. That seems to be like the delineation. What's quite interesting in that, in a sense, is this idea that one of the great promises of the Web3 space is the promise of, let's say, the ownership economy, right? And so when Ethereum pushed out Ether tokens and you got to raise money by disseminating ERC20s, the great promise there is that you would be able to participate in the upside of this thing that you're supporting. And so hypothetically, you could extend that same mechanism to supporting, let's say, the advancement of a writer, right? Like there's a writer who has the ambition to do something over the next few years. They could ostensibly kind of crowd equity fund or whatever.
Pseudo equity, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll get to that. But you could give someone something back in return, which is quite dissimilar in say to the Kickstarter model that most people would be familiar with. Now, quite what that equity represents, quite how if you can indeed take that to the bank, quite how that's going to be abused is something I'm sure we'll get into over the 2 hours. But the basic principle is interesting, right? And I think people are initially interested in it simply for that initial gesture of saying, what does it mean to, for example, participate in a cultural project and have something to show for it that says, if this noons or if this project is successful or relevant in some way, you will be able to participate in the spoils generated from it. And so closer to where I exist, in the music space, for example, this is something that I've talked about for a long time, right? You have a heavy concentration of resources at the top with music space, generally in a more abstract sense, but also formally in the way in which things work, right? And like Sarah, I'm sure you have a lot to say about this in the art world, right? It's like, pop stars are, the Formula One drivers of 100+ people operations that produce these cultural products that are the result of not only the work of like the producers and the art makers and the PR people and so on that go into it, but also the fans themselves, right? And you see this with things like BTS armies or whatever, right? There's a lot of labor that goes from the kind of consumer side to make a pop star something. And so the idea of creating economies around that is very, very interesting, if not flawed, right? And so I think coming from like the Web 2 period where a lot of people have slowly, like the slowest penny has dropped, right? That like we've all contributed all this stuff, whether it be directly to projects or indirectly through, passing the word on, like contributing to the social capital or something. That penny is slowly dropping. That you could potentially build economies that were more rewarding and equitable. I am definitely on the fence about it because I could see interesting use cases of it and I could see horrific use cases of it, but that is roughly why people are interested, because there is demand for something that would offer those affordances, that would offer that potential.
Yeah, definitely. I find I'm just gonna share it with you all. I have a problem with the term social tokens because, as you were saying Matt, at the beginning, that tokens or money-like things are social by definition, otherwise they can't work, right? And so my concern with, and we see we're going to talk about some of these models and examples and what we like and don't like about them. There seems to be this emphasis on the social as something that can immediately be financialized. So there seems to be the term social tokens for me tend to suggest this conflation and take the emphasis away from the problem of organization. That instead, I think it's a lot of these digital communities or kind of collectives or creators, etc., are already very social.
We're humans, right?
Exactly. We are connected with strong social bonds, but then oftentimes there is the problem of organizing in alternative ways, where we're seeing some of these experiments where in fact what is happening is almost just accelerating the tendencies that already exist in the Web 2 space. So just something that I wanted to throw out there.
I think it's fair. It's fair to be critical of the term because I mean I was actually a little bit thinking about the ambiguity of it, like leading up to this panel, which is called socializing tokens. Is the socializing as in what we're doing, sitting around here talking? Is it socializing as in the political tendency? And when we say social tokens, do we mean social as in coming from social media, or do we mean there's something like actually community driven about them? Because the idea of tokenizing your sort of individual practice as a musician or artist is actually not necessarily a community driven operation. It's very individualist instead.
Okay, now that we've taken apart the social part, I thought we could also discuss the token part. Because like the word token is also not a new word, right? So like people have been inscribing things onto clay tablets in Sumeria for thousands of years. You can think of Kocherlakota to describe money as memory. So we can talk about these things as ways of keeping record. And so tokens have always been social. We've always been humans. We've always been exchanging and trying to understand and remember and record our interactions with each other. And I just see this as another iteration of that, for good and for ill.
Totally. And what you're seeing as well, I mean, you see, I don't want to, well, I guess it's a way of talking about NFTs or whatever, but it's like, it's also, if you're thinking about like quantifying the social graph around a person or a project, again, to make the comparison with Web2, this is stuff that happens, it just happens opaquely, right? Like, this is how Web2 businesses work. Like, if you can quantify the activity around...
You don't see the algorithm.
Yes, exactly. The person or the project, you gather those statistics and you add arbitrary values to them. It's just all of that is happening somewhere in a room at Twitter or somewhere in a room at Facebook. There is this kind of... I mean, there's like legitimate concerns about, you know, how these things can be gamed, how individualist these things might end up becoming, how scammy they might end up becoming. And then there's like a separate concern, I think, which is also just rendering transparent all the interactions and the kind of economic, for want of a better term, interactions around a product or activity or a person, and the future shock of that, where it's like, that's kind of also like, you know, as you see that this a little bit in the NFT space, right? Where people are like, NFTs are making, you know, art disgusting and speculative, and you're like, no, it's just, you can see now. So, but like,
It just happened.
Anyone who's a professional could have told you that, but see it,
Yeah.
right? And so actually, like, there's also the future shock of, you know, shooting the messenger a little bit of saying, well, actually, like, if you did want to, you know, figure out some kind of an ownership regime or an ownership economy, whatever you want to call, around cultural products, you're also going to have to deal with the stickiness of all this information.
And the metrics and so on.
Yeah.
Let's just very quickly say, once we get onto metrics, this is kind of like a particular bugbear of mine. I used to design heuristics for cryptocurrency networks. And there's two things which we must always discuss, which is Goodhart's law, which is a kind of aphorism that is mostly invoked in economics, which suggests that if a metric becomes a measure, it ceases to be a good metric.
Sure.
Because everyone will gain for and optimize for it.
Yeah.
In the blockchain milieu, because there's more transparency, it just usually means that the nefarious activity of the skullduggery just moves a layer down your technological or your social stack. And the other one is related, Wittgenstein's ruler, which is like the ruler is, you're measuring the operator as well as the, you know, the ruler's measure of itself as well as the thing you're trying to measure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's good to bear in mind.
Definitely. And maybe on this point, I wanted to read a comment from one of our viewers, Grace Raj, which is quite pertinent. I think it seems that we need to rethink this idea of labor. If we are talking about social behaviors, non-action is just as important. When we emphasize action, we get a lot of loud, obnoxious people competing to show what they did. Being humble doesn't get you any credit.
There is no reward for not retweeting the annoying NFT takes on Twitter with salty quotes.
This is
But maybe there should be.
It's so true. And actually, if you think about it, I've often said that, like, you never get, how'd you put it? Like, you never get applauded for the opportunities you didn't take. And so there's people, for example, I mean, in the kind of the signal like chaos of Twitter, there's people who can make make reputations for themselves by being very publicly against things. And there's other people who like don't do things, and that non-participation is also kind of invisible, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Let's tell Jack to implement slashing on Twitter.
It's funny, I forget, what's the native currency of World of Warcraft?
The gold, is it something gold?
The
something
guild
gold?
currency.
I don't know.
just listening to Justin around talking about currency exchanges like within the guilds on World of Warcraft, and the non-participation part reminded me a little bit, where basically there you have a scenario where, so the basic idea, as far as I understand it, is you have a gaming guild that goes to raid against this dragon or something, and they all have to partner together to kill the dragon because no one individually can do it. The dragon gives away this loot. The loot can't be disseminated to everybody in the guild because there's like 40 people and it only drops 5 items, and so they've come up with their own currency that that manages to distribute that loot to those who need it the most.
I remember the article we were talking about before the discussion about insurance pooling. Yeah,
exactly.
It's very much related to that, where like a minor league baseball player might become part of this kind of pseudo union, and because nobody knows who will make it, and so then the loot, the people that make it get signed by major league teams, can be a bit more equitably distributed.
Exactly, but what you need to do, and Josh was explaining in this, is that oftentimes you have players who don't give the most damage. They're not the most adroit or adept players, but you still have to incentivize them to be part of the guild. And so ultimately the currency will be passed to those who, they're not non-participants, but they're certainly like quieter participants than your kind of like A team in order to keep the guild running, because you actually need those people, right?
Very interesting. Well, as you're mentioning guilds, maybe it could be nice to, I don't know, try to think of this tokenized communities or social tokens within a larger, maybe historical trajectory of organizational forms, and how some of these, ancient forms of collective organizations, social and economic, like as I understand, also like guilds, for instance, kind of like to, try and challenge the real demystify this like sense of newness and like novelty that, Pokemon talk about. Anything that's to do with blockchain.
Do you want to start from the start? Because I believe that like the Knights Templar basically invented letters of credit.
Okay.
pretty much invented banking, right? So
Yeah,
you can
right.
start. I used to spend the winters in Malta, so I went to some of their old hangouts. So I guess it started. It's not new. It's definitely not new. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I thought when I was reading the article you posted about, among other things, these baseball collectives, I was like, this is a symptom of the failure of the state to redistribute wealth and care for aging populations. So it's not a new model. It's actually like a completely old model interpreted in a voluntaristic and industry-specific form.
Yeah, there is the voluntaristic element. Actually, I'm wondering, like, to what extent perhaps some of the models, if not like token-supported models of organization, need to rely on like voluntaristic participation, or I guess this is like
We're talking about altruism more specifically.
Yeah. I guess this will lead us maybe to talk about incentives also. But I'm wondering if there's also maybe a potential for some of these new instruments to move beyond this kind of like forms of voluntaristic, altruistic kind of participation.
Well, I think Circles is a great example of kind of incentivized voluntarism or incentivized altruism or something like that. It seems to be like in that, at least in that middle zone between the two. I wonder if you could speak a bit to that, Sarah.
I'm curious how you think Circles is incentivizing altruism.
Well, because nobody is selling something, so people are incentivized to participate in the network and participate in the trust formation and bring people that they know into the network, and they're rewarded with this pseudocurrency that's given to them on this kind of like algorithmically defined schedule, but nobody is necessarily buying it or selling it. That's why I'm saying it's somehow it's altruistic mode.
Right, I see. That's an interesting way to describe the fact that no one is buying and selling it. For
at least entry into the system specifically.
So you could say that taking goods or services that you might sell for fiat and choosing to sell them for Circles on the part of the vendor is an altruistic act. I think that's definitely true. It's interesting that currently the idea I'm most excited about with regard to Circles is actually looking to change that. or kind of to add a layer on top of circles that makes it easier to develop an exchange rate with fiat, which I suppose is a bit less idealistic than the circles project as a whole, but it's, I think, much more practical. And also an idea that's a bit related to this panel, because circles is already kind of a social token in Matt's definition, in that it's a token that a person has that, you know, is only partially fungible for other similar persons' tokens, but it's to add a kind of group token layer on top of circles where people can burn their personal tokens for the group token. And the group token by size can become easier for people to understand and possibly track against fiat.
So is it a feature that the group token?
This is something I like to talk about and might build if I have time later this year. So yeah, it's fun. It's funny that like to critique the whole or to maybe bring up some of the tensions around purely altruistic incentives, like this very altruistically motivated project, Circles. Actually, the direction I'm maybe most excited in taking it right now is to make it a bit less altruistic and maybe a little bit more practically useful.
Idealism can only get you so far. I think in this hyper-economic landscape, I think some realism is welcome.
We have another couple of comments with regard to the sports players that I kind of want to relate here. So the idea of tokenizing, Grace Ratchet, same person on before, said the idea of tokenizing the sports players is problematic in two ways. One is that the person who ended up making the professional league played against all those inferior players in training. In other words, all the players created the best player, but only the best player gets the credit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the problem is that the indentured servitude problem, people are betting on your future.
I shouldn't laugh immediately when someone says the indentured servitude problem. I laugh only because we already talked about it.
We're extremely black-pilled here, so this is not the first time we've thought about these things.
On the optimistic side of something, I was talking to a group yesterday and used the analogy. This is discrete from what you're describing with the baseball players, but use that analogy of again, going back to the pop star, I was the pop star is the center forward in a football team, where you need one to score the goals, but fundamentally, everything completely falls apart if you don't have a team there, and if you don't have a second team there that the team trains with, and if you don't have and so at least engendering that awareness, I welcome the problem of trying to figure out that economics, and we're so early to this that. Fundamentally, one of the critiques at the moment that I think is very valid is the only people who at the moment have any chance of winning in this space are people who can think of ways to devise their own economies around what they're doing. And of course, in reality, that's not going to happen. In reality, what's going to happen is you're going to figure out 7 to 10 templates that will expand to hopefully 7 to 10,000 different templates for how to structure something like this with different incentive models in place.
We see this kind of power law thing everywhere. I mean, let's come back to music. Look at the lineup of a festival and then look at who gets paid what. And it's kind of there's the white dude at the top and they get 80% of the money and then the rest is scraps. Spotify works pretty much the same way, just the parameters of that distribution are slightly different and skewed, but it's ultimately the same thing. So maybe there's a way that this socializing or insurance pooling type model can spread that a little more equitably, but the indentured servitude problem is real, right? If you own rights to a person's future stuff.
Oh, and I think that's also where it may be. This wasn't really on the sheet, but again to go back to problematizing or rethinking the social part of tokens is in a sense one of the reasons I was most excited about this space was thinking about how could the smart contract be the institution? How could basically agreements between people enshrined on a blockchain be the leanest institution that you need, right? So if you think about a gallery system, a gallery system is very much structured in a very hyper-individualized way, right? Where there's there's global costs or overheads to the gallery, but like if you sell something for $1 million, I don't get anything. In fact, if anything, it probably ends up hurting me because then they're like, well, why aren't you selling something for $1 million? We should get more people in here to sell things for $1 million, right? So thinking of the leanest possible gallery or representation structure, you could say, okay, we could build a smart contract in here. Now that to me is an inherently social application of tokens. Because what you're talking about is creating agreements between people that are pro-social, that incorporate in advance all of the different contributions that people bring to your reputation and to the reputation of the group. That's a very social thing, but that's very distinct from the idea of, say, we're all going to launch a token together and give it to everybody. Those are two very separate use cases, but very pro-social, And the smart contract institution to me is actually far less complicated than the idea of thinking about what if we get tokens to everybody and like manage this, because the incentive, I'm sure we'll spend like an hour on all the incentive nightmares that you can see start there. It's like that's a pro-social token usage that doesn't require minting a currency.
Yeah, and also with the word institution, I just want to really quickly bring in this work that Schingler and De Filippi are doing on exstitutional theory. So as a kind of a counterpoint to institutions. So the idea that institutions are these kind of formalized, bounded structures. They seek to protect themselves at the expense of what's outside them. They generate externalities, sounds like crypto networks, right? And so the institution is the kind of the things that exist outside of that, the looser, less formal things. Yeah, it's a nice lens to think with these things. It's early days on that particular one. Institutional theory. Yeah, it's a nice conceptual lens for this.
That's very nice. I was actually thinking, as you were talking about smart contract as institutions, and thinking about current institutions already have some form of like, bureaucracy is always some kind of automatic process, and so smart contracts can actually do automate,
100%.
even maybe more so, or like, take away some of the struggle of like, getting things to flow, like, or, unlocking treasure funds for a group or making the teams together or whatever. Like,
but you could argue that the political questions aren't solved; they're merely redistributed.
Oh, yeah. Particularly not when you don't actually. I mean, and this is again why I understand a lot of them get annoyed with crypto people. Is like a lot of the hubris kind of doesn't understand what the smart contract of the traditional institution does. Right? It's like there's a legitimate critique of all institutions for all kinds of reasons, like centralized power, like bloat. Kind of like, inefficiency, bureaucracy, things that don't need to exist, but they also exist for a reason, right? And it's like, actually, it would be really great to be able to like look at all of institutions and say like, well, if you were to write the most lean application of what this institution's function is, what would that look like? And could that be replicated? Because in some cases it maybe couldn't, right? And but I think that's going to be a useful way to think about these things. And as I say, it's very different from the category of quote-unquote social tokens that will be written about, which generally is like, I'm Matt, buy Matt. Buy Matt token. By the way, buy Matt token.
I heard they're not printing anymore.
It's super scarce. Yeah.
Vote red.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's actually deflationary. We're burning by the minute. It's only up with Matt token. You're there first. No, but you see, there's like very different applications of what these things could be.
Yeah. Well, there is the TCFXYZ that is asking us, are you not afraid that these models, even if they are created, won't win in the marketplace?
Which models?
The social ones.
Social token models that maybe moving beyond the individual, like, shoot, kind of model. Like, maybe I guess what's the relationship? What's the relationship between these like tokenized communities and the open market? Like, do they need this to?
This is maybe a great time to talk about friends with benefits.
Mm.
Community token versus the open market.
Yeah.
I have one quick thing before if we do talk about friends with benefits. This is a general concern I have, and I don't know if it speaks to TCFX's. I wonder who that is. Question, but there is a genuine concern I have. When I was talking to this group in Switzerland yesterday, I was saying, look, like the Formula One analysis I give to like cultural figures, where you have this kind of like huge resource intensive person at the top, and then this kind of foundation of poorly compensated people underneath them.
Sounds like a pyramid, Matt. If
it was, it would kind of be like I don't know what the
there'll be
some exactly. There'll be some like exactly, more a ziggurat. But like but one concern I do have, which is maybe speaking a little bit to the question, is like, if one were to kind of remove this mythology around like the individual genius, like would it still be possible to create successful, dynamic, kind of growing cultural products? Because most cultural products that we understand, this is more like, that's how we know that they have succeeded in the past, right? We buy into the 20th century myth that the painter did all the work themselves, and that there wasn't, price speculation colluded by a few people in New York at the time to ensure that that was the painter that was going to define 1965, right? Like, we want to believe these things, and the same happens with music, right? Or
literally CIA funding to make.
Exactly. It's like we want to believe these things, but of course we've lost our naivety, and like a lot of this kind of like, for better and worse, like a lot of the kind of rendering transparent of the machinations of the culture industry and the financial industries, like we lose a certain degree of naivety in that process, but there still isn't it still isn't confirmed that like, let's say an interdependent system in which everybody gets paid and you're building this big collective project together would succeed as well in the attention marketplace as the kind of lone genius thing. However, I'm pretty optimistic on that, because I think that, like, again, to bring up the BTS army and like, which of course is a very hierarchical thing, but you bring up certain structures like that where you have like, there's this kind of like almost like a drama of participation. Like the artwork is kind of on the fan side, these things get kind of enshrined with like videos every now and then, but the participation is the art form, in the sense like that is the cultural product, is that you get excited and you go online and you meet other people who are into army, and like, right. I'm pretty enthused, at least, that those kind of squad models, to borrow a term from you all, are pretty dangerous in an attention marketplace. Quite whether they will inevitably lead to utopian outcomes or whatever, I'm not sure. But I think in the marketplace, if anything, they're more adept or more kind of like they're more what's the word, like
resilient or something.
It's more kind of like more native to how people participate in culture now.
Yeah.
And so generally speaking, I think it's not naive to think that they might well endure and be resilient.
I think I guess a few things, like the kind of structure that you're describing, where you have this kind of pyramid of workers supporting one very famous person. I feel like it might be reasonable to separate, like, what if that was a community, we were tokenizing this community. We should probably separate fame sharing and profit sharing.
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe we can't share fame, but maybe like everyone on the bottom makes a living wage. And I think that would be a big improvement already.
Yeah.
And regarding, fame sharing and this person on the top, I think there are other really comparable structures. Like a company or a brand, maybe to reference something else some people in this panel have written about, but also like an avatar, like a company running a digital influencer, maybe, for example.
Totally.
So the famous name doesn't really need to be like even an actual human.
It isn't
in a lot of cases.
Sorry. I'm thinking of the hero's journey. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, like, maybe we're kind of going towards some kind of typology towards like how important the hero's journey is in the creation of this social imaginary and the economic infrastructure and whatever else that gets built around it. Is this hero's journey, does it have supremacy over everything? Mm-hmm. Is it something that can kind of attenuate over time as this community matures and builds? Mm-hmm. Or is it something that is it scaffolding that we can later remove and we don't need it? I don't think we know the answers to these questions.
Totally, and it's not necessarily like mutually exclusive, right? Because the distinction, in a sense, would be to bring up the a headless brand analogy. What you were referencing could well reference like the Michaela analogy. So Trevor will eventually get to Friends with Benefits. Like Trevor, who also started Friends with Benefits, started Michaela, and like our discussions, which I mean, to be honest, I was sold on from quite early, was the whole idea of being like, no, actually, like having a digital avatar here is incredibly resource efficient, because you have inefficiencies with all of the resources being shared by one human at the top, and also liabilities, right? Like we now live in a time where like you can see entire movie productions or record productions that people have been working on for 2 years ruined because someone tweets something stupid or like is a dick, I mean, like, so so there's the great liabilities to these things too. Now, the idea of saying no, what if, and I've got a feeling that our dear listener TCFX will have a lot to say about this, but what if swarms of 10,000 people were working on creating a cultural product? It doesn't necessarily deter or change the hero's journey, but I think it changes your relationship to the hero's journey, right? Because you're not then the kind of prostrate witness to the hero's journey, watching the Rocky movie being like, go Rocky. You're writing the hero's journey collectively with a bunch of people. So you still get to have the hero's journey there, right? But you get to participate in creating that moment. And I think that whatever that aesthetic is, actually when I was trying to think of a neologism, I was like, usphoria. I don't know if that works. but there's some kind of whatever connects BTS Army and the Link Marines and all these things that we associate with cultish behavior and we associate with shammy, shilly behavior.
Euphoria, Y-O-U.
Yeah, well, that's why I said usphoria. Yeah, but yeah, exactly.
Euphoria.
Yeah, exactly. Euphoria, whatever. There's gonna be some term there, but whatever that is an aesthetic. It's a participatory aesthetic of constructing something that I think can be as rewarding as receiving the hero's journey when you watch Rocky or Star Wars or something like that, right? And that's the big bet. And that's ultimately why I think Michaela is thinking about fully decentralized. I mean, that's why, because if you were to create something as culturally kind of powerful as Disney or whatever in the early 20th century, you would be thinking along those lines.
It's also probably more humane if it's not a human. I don't know about you, but I've often watched celebrity dramas play out and thought they have the character of human sacrifice. We feed and pamper and ultimately destroy. But especially with, I also posted, there's this New York Times article recently about a kind of new era of influencer monetization platforms. And one of them I think was called New, which lets, people on your social media, literally control what your followers, literally control what you're doing. Which is well, first off, a number of things. One, talk about the dystopian examples of, turning yourself into a token. But then also I think, Matt, it was you who described this whole space as bringing with it future shock.
Totally.
And the whole project being called New just seems like future shock to me.
Yeah.
We've run out of words. It's new. It's new.
Yeah,
new is not new enough.
Yeah. But imagining doing this to a character, an audience controlling the character's behavior, ultimately a much more humane proposition.
100%. And going into the traditional what people tend to describe social tokens as, that's also one of the big concerns, which is funny, it's not native to the space necessarily. There are people in the kind of more familiar Web 2, iOS app kind of infrastructure with new thinking of ways to be controlled by crowds, right? And that's one of the concerns in social tokens is what are the incentives there if I say as an artist, give a bunch of tokens to people and I'm an artist that's known for doing this popular thing. And then I'm like, oh, I have this support structure now. I'm going to go and have my weird period. And they're like, no, you're fucking not. We all hold this token. You're going to make more of what made us, interested in you in the first place, right? There's no real way of escaping that dynamic.
Get back in the hole. This ain't no union shop.
Exactly. You can pour flames on that. But yeah, but that new thing is hideous. Again, you don't need crypto to create dystopian scenarios. Let's be real. Yeah.
So is this a good moment to move to talking about incentives and economic models that we've started already?
Totally.
So.
We can also talk about friends and benefits at some point. I didn't want to cut you off on that point. Sorry.
No, I was
I'm
just...
sure it will come up.
Yeah. I know you've been part of the community. I kind of would love to hear your perspective as an insider, because as an outsider, I've had sort of my own kind of observations or questions about it. But, the inside scoop.
Yeah.
For those non-token holding,
Tell us the story. Tell us the history of friends with benefits for those of us not so familiar. That'd be should we do it now?
Wow.
Sure. Yeah. So so basically the idea. So usually kind of twin to a social token. Oftentimes people discuss community tokens, and the community tokens. There's more that exist, but basically you can get a pretty good understanding of most community tokens that have existed by looking at the role. There's role, I forget, role.fm or something there, who recently hacked, which is a whole other story. But basically some of the biggest kind of community tokens, the basic idea is that you have a token that represents your membership in a particular community, and then you get certain benefits from doing that. Now, I think one of the first big ones is called Whale. And Whale is this kind of art vault that was created by this guy called Whale Shark. And basically, you buy into Whale, and then, or you get given Whale for participating in the Whale community. And the Whale community now is a Discord that has like meetups, and it's pretty insane. I mean, like, and you get to go in there, and like, if you contribute some artwork to a Whale messaging thing, then you get more Whale. It's like they're building an institution out
How many
of it.
people are in the Discord, man? Roughly, do you know?
For Whale,
Yeah.
I mean, it's thousands.
Thousands.
Yeah. And you can go. I've been in the Whale Discord, and like, there's a lot of activity there. It's not necessarily something I want to participate in, but it's like, but it is legitimately like a community, as one would understand a forum community or whatever to be. Now, Friends with Benefits was a similar idea. So started by Trevor, who started Brud, which is the Michaela company. And it was a basic experiment starting there, where he was like, look, I'm just going to mint these tokens, and I'm going to give them to a bunch of people I know. I was one of the early people to be just given these tokens that were worth nothing. And basically what the tokens do is they give you access to a Discord. And then you can go in that Discord and start to, talk in the, in the dark forest or whatever.
But these aren't NFTs. These are like normal tokens.
They're
in
just
certain balance to
ERC20s,
get
the ERC20s. And then the whole idea was, I think initially you needed about 50 Friends with Benefits tokens to be able to participate. And that worked out, I think at first, to be like $30 or something along those lines. But of course, as the social graph grew and more people were like, oh, what are you doing here? And like liquidity providers came in, it got to the point whereby to access Friends with Benefits was like in the thousands, just simply to get access to this Discord. Which I don't think was ever really the intention, and now the price has dropped considerably since the hack, but that's a whole other question. But the whole basic idea was like, you're inside this Discord, and it's like, how do you build out kind of, in my mind, it's somewhere a hybrid between like, it's hybridizing like a publication model and what people understand a Discord to be. So for example, Friends with Benefits tokens were used to commission writers to write exclusive pieces just for the community that were hosted on Discord. Friends with Benefits tokens were also offered to Substacks to basically crowd negotiate subscriptions to things. So if somebody had a newsletter that a bunch of people there voted inside the Friends with Benefits Discord, they say they liked, someone on the Friends with Benefits team, because there is literally a team now. There's admins there who I believe are paid in Friends with Benefits tokens, would go to that Substack and say, hey, we have a couple thousand people here, who want to read your Substack, like, can we get a deal or something along these lines, right? And so in terms of access, there's all kind of things to talk about, to discuss about that. But in terms of the actual experiment, that's been my impression of it. And I mean, the one thing that I've enjoyed about it in a sense is that, Trust has a great Discord. Our friends New Models also have a great Discord. Is it feels very much of the time to kind of have a place to defect away from the kind of, you wouldn't quite say public square of Twitter, but like the battlefield of Twitter, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I remember we were talking in Salon the other day about the dark forest and the digital cozies and the public square, and we have these different gradations of like how bounded a community is. And I wonder, as the access price of the Friends with Benefits Discord server increased, it's kind of like the institutional barriers formed
100%
as a side product of that. Yeah.
Exactly. And this is another big question about access, right? Because like Friends with Benefits was initially an experiment. It also happened to be an experiment conducted by people who happened to have a lot of friends who could probably afford that price to entry, right? Because it was done amongst like business people initially. But of course, this question of access is quite tricky, right? Because like, I've personally been like a bit of a critic of kind of the utopian promise of like, complete access that came with the web and like how that went, right? And so the fact that one of the early experiments in this kind of like tokenized community model things did end up becoming so expensive and in a sense quite prohibitive to access.
Exclusionary.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody couldn't just fork it or like go do another one, right? Like you could make and see 20,000 of these things, some of which may choose to learn from that and say, okay, well, what we're going to do is just cap the price of this. Right, so that basically, you'll never have to pay more than $10 to become a member or something like this. But that's how Friends with Benefits has been going.
It depends how much you let the market decide. So I'm designing some token economic models at the moment where we have kind of two access mechanisms. One that's kind of marketplace determined, another one that's determined with the issuer. And so like if you're the issuer, obviously you have to take on some responsibilities to be that person. It's not decentralized anymore, permissionless. But you can create a floor or a cap for a price by being the buyer or seller of last resort, and you can prevent this runaway exclusionary trend.
I think one of the things I've been thinking about, or regarding the run up of the Friends with Benefits token price and subsequent collapse, is that there almost seems to be, with the simple and direct relationship of like only so many tokens get you access to the community relationship, is like they seem to be in a bit in opposition, that like to grow a community requires stability, but markets require liquidity. So I think that what happened was that there was a community that was stable, and therefore there was like no liquidity because no one was selling. And I guess you would, the class of the average Friends with Benefits hodler might not have been such that the several $1,000 or whatever, entry price was a life-changing amount of money, so they chose to like hodl through it. But that would not be true of like every class of people, and there would come a point in the token run-up where the community would collapse because of profit taking.
But that's one thing that was interesting. So basically, like 2 weeks ago, Roll was hacked, and Roll held. It's like Roll is kind of an interesting kind of like Web 2.5 kind of service where they mint social tokens for you really easily, but they also serve as like a centralized treasury for those tokens.
You think of it as middleware, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah. And so one of their wallets got hacked, and a bunch of these tokens were converted to ETH, and basically the liquidity providers for Friends with Benefits and other ones were the ones that got hit the most. But one interesting dynamic to that, I do have to say, is that following that on Friends with Benefits, where you do have, it's a pretty widespread. I mean, like there's people in there who, as I say, like they're in the crypto upper classes. And then there's people in there who were given tokens, and this is their first experiment with anything like this. I expect that this is probably the first time they ever had a wallet to hold these things. What was striking about all of it is that not really many people were selling, and actually most people held. And in fact, many people tried to buy the dip. But the conversation there wasn't, even when the token was at high prices, wasn't like, oh, how do I get rid of this? There was more kind of like discussion about like, well, what does this mean for participation here? Because actually a lot of people have come to really enjoy it in there.
So there was this ideological bent to the community, as well as maybe like, obviously there's going to be different constituencies within a community. There's not a contiguous entity.
Totally.
But it sounds like there was like a genuine community spirit there.
Yeah, I think
I remember though that when this Roll hack happened, that quite ironically it seemed to be like an inside job at the end.
It doesn't look good, does it?
So, but what happened is that then all these discussions, I remember, like I follow mostly like from the outside, and these discussions with relation to the role of the token in mediating access to a community is when the token itself is called in question because of these external, hacks or like problems. So, to what extent, like you need to have, and I remember like people discussing questions of, like liquidity and like need to, increase the velocity of your money or allow these tokens to circulate and find discover the price of the market, etc. So, again, I don't know. One question that I had there is like, to what extent one would need to bake these kind of economic mechanisms of like buy and sell and create demand and supply at the start of one of these experiments. Because I remember like for Friends with Benefits, what was really, and what has been so nice, up to now, is really a live laboratory of like, trying to figure, like grapple with these questions like very practically. And so, as I understand at the beginning, it's very much like a Discord with like a bunch of people and without really thinking about all these like economic questions.
Totally. And also doing it in an environment, I think that was part of the idea, to doing it in an environment where there's not so much damage if things go a bit weird. Right, because that's the other side to the access question here too, right? Is that like
keeping
the stakes relatively low, where it was like done amongst a bunch of people who, like the vast majority of people who participate in Friends with Benefits, were given it for free or bought it for like $50 max, the vast majority, right? And then when things do go sour or unexpected things turn up, you're kind of like, okay, like that's why I don't think many people who are participating in that community have any like false kind of pretenses about like what it aspires to be long term, but it is an economic experiment in the space. And maybe it's better in the sense that it wasn't capped initially, so that you can actually see how these how these dynamics might take place.
But and I guess there's a related question is like, it sounds a lot like friends with benefits kind of baked in an economic model, which is reminiscent of many of the models we've seen in the cryptocurrency, blockchain technology space. I guess the question is like, is that model really the best one to use when we're trying to foreground the social and community aspects of these projects?
Totally.
Yeah. So we actually have a lot of questions and comments from our viewer. There is Mauricio that says, how do you structure successful incentives without some kind of gamification and levels you can achieve? And how does this not eventually develop into another class system, like the ziggurat that we were talking about before?
The reason I mentioned ziggurat is because I was working on a secret book project a few years ago, which I suppose I can talk about now. It's a bit controversial. I was looking at the inside asymmetries in P2P monetary networks. And I was using the model of the ziggurats. I was going to build pyramids out of the unfair power structures of all the currencies. I was looking at all their Gini coefficients and all of the obfuscation that happens underneath the surfaces. And the core developers of these networks were coming to me saying, there's a cartel, there's a dictator, nobody can see it. Please help us do something about it. It was so controversial. Nobody would touch it, nobody would fund it. And I had to go off and do something else.
I love that you were doing that though. Maybe scrap that part from the documentation.
It was called Dowsing Don'ts, by the way.
Dowsing Don'ts.
I want to suggest that I don't think having incentives always involves levels. I do think most financial systems can be thought of as games, though. So it's hard to get away from that. And I want to add something I've been thinking about, which is like maybe a bit far out, but I've been thinking about incentives in general and the idea of financial incentives as being parts of a system that we can think of as a game that only actually work because of things that are happening off the board. For example, we only want financial incentives because we live in a capitalist economy and we need money to live. If we didn't need money to live, we wouldn't want financial incentives. So all of these games are only working because of what's happening outside of the game itself. And I guess that is to say that I guess the question is about disentangling class from financial incentives. And I'm not sure you can, because if we lived in a world without class, why would anyone want financial incentives in the first place?
But you do have, as a designer of these systems or mechanisms, you do have some power or sway over kind of where the externalities lie, or what things you're pushing out of the system and which things you're accounting for within the system. And we see like there is a bit of a spectrum in the crypto world already about things which have maximal externalities, like you may have heard of Bitcoin. That's like big externality engine, and you have things which are trying to reason a bit more, sense a bit more about their potential externalities. And so maybe we can move towards a more pluralistic mindset, but I don't know if we're there yet.
The question of incentives is obviously really closely related with the question of metrics. And as you were saying, Wassim, before, and metrics of sociality, which seems like a lot of these communities, trying to measure and reward meaningful contributions, but the way they are doing that is very much reliant on the type of platform. So where this, conversation or interactions happen. And and I guess that I don't know, I see some danger perhaps in creating systems that are so inbuilt or embedded in any one particular platform to then replicate perhaps this kind of dynamics that maybe are not financial per se, but they are very much, as you were saying, related to a financial way of conceiving of the act of measuring, the act of participation. Again, as we were saying before, no one has ever been rewarded for not adding to a conversation or reacting.
Maybe here we can mention the Gitcoin spam crisis and quadratic voting. It's also relevant to Black Swan, which we'll be talking about later today, which was a project in funding art projects. And used this new model of allocating voting weight called quadratic voting. Now, because of the way it works, the idea is you're trying to avoid deep-pocketed players pushing things around in terms of governance, so that your vote weight increases with the square of the number of votes you use, rather than linearly, which is the normal like one person, one vote thing. So in Gitcoin, which is just a way to distribute seed funding to early stage projects on Ethereum, pretty much, there's a big problem now where the thing has grown so much that people are building kind of bots and automated systems to make more accounts, to do more voting, so that they can have more vote weight at the expense of, the little players.
Yeah.
And it seems that this is settled on human verification as the last line of defense. And so, we tried to automate it and it didn't really work.
Yeah.
Now we have humans checking everything because the humans still have that kind of finer grained judgment about how these social graphs are interconnected. People looking at pairwise interactions, like you vote for me, I vote for you, and trying to see that as a heuristic of like possible collusion and so on.
Yeah, yeah.
So like we always have there's always a new metric and there's always a new problem with a new metric.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and also to speak to that, it's like if you're talking about like metrics for compensating people, I mean, a lot of the reason why these projects in some cases can come across as quite uninspiring, I think, is also just the reality that like only so many measurable things are on chain right now, right? So like the few things that are on chain are like, oh, you can have a token that like increase in value based on participation in this Discord because Collabland exists. So we can try this in a Discord because there's this one thing that could put Discord somewhat on chain. You can put a Discord bot like interacting with the chain. And you're like, yeah, like actually in like some kind of insane scenario, you can think of a scenario in which you're incentivized. I've ranted about this a long time. It's just like, show me, let's start a community of people who are trying to, incentivize people to start restaurants and like paying people across borders using these currencies that are apparently way faster and way cheaper and not impeded with the same baggage as Western Union and all these kind of things. Like none of those, like so little of that externality is kind of like on chain or like able to be analyzed that it's very difficult to develop the kind of cool incentive structure that you might want to do where you're benefiting people in accordance with real shit that they're doing in the world that's actually really great. And so you get these kind of like toy experiments that end up being kind of bloated, and it's like, well, ultimately, because there are a lot of like community tokens and the whole idea is like, you can't buy the token, you have to participate to get it, right? You have to go to the Discord and run a session or, run a Q&A or write the Q&A and then you get the token. It's like, that's not a negative necessarily, like a model to incentivize participation. It's just the participation doesn't produce that much value in the real world. It feels very insular and kind of a bit trite sometimes,
Seen projects that not necessarily social in nature, but they've used those similar kinds of dynamics. So there's a project which is trying to incentivize mesh networking, or P2P internet data transfer. And they are rewarding people, or they were rewarding people to go off and read documentation to RTFM.
Yeah.
And then also to run a mesh networking node to provide
Is this Helium?
with. Sorry?
Is this Helium?
I'm actually thinking of Althea, but like
Okay.
multiple projects like this exist. And so it's not a particular social project, but they're using this similar kind of dynamics to try and build and bootstrap the community.
And then the question comes back to your point earlier that like ultimately, you can't automate everything. So like it's easy for me to say on the one hand, oh, more stuff needs to be on chain. And then you're like, well, okay, well, there's also negative consequences to everything being on chain. Like what is worth being on chain to be able to make these things interesting enough? Do we want to be able to like take like super gamified incentive mechanisms to meat space, for want of a better term? Like, is that positive? Like, do we lose more than we gain from doing that? But these experiments will take place. It's just right now, I think a lot of them come across as like more trite than they necessarily are because there's so little to experiment with. It's like, yeah.
I really don't want to say it, but it sound when you were talking just then, Matt, I was thinking about Pokemon Go on the blockchain. I'm sorry. I don't build it.
I've heard those three words.
CryptoKitties with proof of location.
Exactly. CryptoKitty walking services. Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, isn't it?
So I guess something I like to bring up when we talk about introducing, well, first, I mean, the broad history of like introducing measurements into things that were previously unmeasurable is like not a great history. It's just like people fuck that one up like a lot over and over, and introduced a lot of what we might call perverse incentives. So we should always be cognizant of this, but then I guess an example I like to think about of some moment, actually very social, fitting for our subject, where measurements were introduced to something that was previously unmeasured is the rise of social media in general. It's actually already a game. It's full of quantifiable aspects of one person's.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I now have some sense of the follower count of everyone at this table. And, you know, if we were speaking 20 years ago, I wouldn't have had that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think I personally have mixed feelings about what this has added to the world. I don't know about you.
No, I'm totally with you. I mean, I've definitely so I teach classes generally to 18 to 22-year-olds. And it's really funny. Like, we've been talking about like NFTs and this stuff for a long time, and like social tokens and so on and so forth. And it's really funny because I'm definitely like in the millennial camp where I'm in my mid-30s, and like the people I know who are in my age and above who are super naive to this stuff are like, I can't believe that we're metricizing culture and this is the end of the world. And I'm just like, where the fuck have you been? When I talk to 18-year-olds, like they've known their friends' follower account since they were 6. You know, like they've been living under this on our watch, by the way, not my watch because I was a bit too young, but like people older than me who were like, crypto and metricizing things is terrible. I'm like, you were the ones that like saw that, you know, could have seen this coming. You didn't say anything. And actually, like, how naive in a sense and how aloof that you would be somehow dismissive of the fact that actually you've got 18-year-olds now who were not naive in the slightest bit to the metricization of everything that they've grown under the regime of. And now they're looking at it and they're like, we're not grossed out by that. We just want to fucking stake in it. We want to have some way of managing it and maybe making it more equitable or maybe choosing to dismiss it. But trust us, we know it's there, right? And it's like, it's only people that tend to be my age and above that are like shocked by this. Because like, you know, TikTok is like something they read about in an article in the New York Times like every 2 months. You know, this is their extent of exposure to it. So you're totally right. I mean, it's like this is for better and worse. Well, no, mostly for worse, I would say. Like, this is how things have been run. And so the question then pragmatically is, well, is it better than to be able to wrangle those dynamics, confront them and give people some agency over them, you know, because they're not going away. It's not like if we reject social tokens or community tokens or whatever these ideas are, it's not like Facebook's going to be like, oh yeah, guys, sorry,
We'll pack it up and go home.
I mean, sorry. You know. And they tried doing that, right? I mean, like Instagram tried taking the likes away. I don't know if you remember this. Like for like 5 hours. It was like this huge thing. They were like, yeah, you know, this is a bit too much, guys. And like after 5 hours, they're like, sorry.
Well, academia is doing this as well. Like, so even outside of the commercial space, like academia is parameterized to the hill. We have it in the UK. It's literally called publish or perish. If you don't publish in the high impact journals, which is like a arbitrary metric,
on your own dime.
Game, mostly on your own dime, unless you publish in an open access nice journal, which is funded some other way.
Totally.
Then yeah, so this thing is nothing new. Then each academic or each researcher also has this thing that we call H index, which is like you live or die by these parameters. And so people are trying to game the systems to get more papers to publish, to get more citations in these more favorable journals so that they can survive.
And the H index, for those who don't know, right, it's kind of like a way of, it's like a metric of influence, right?
Yes.
So it's like, it's some way of saying beyond, you know, because you could publish a lot and then nobody would republish. So it's kind of like analyzing retweets. Yeah, exactly.
Just very briefly. So if you have an H index of 1, it means you've published at least one paper that's been cited at least once. If you have an H index of 10, it means you've published at least 10 papers, each cited 10 times. So this is actually another like power law thing is going on here. Yeah.
So wait, I've never published a paper, but I've been cited a bunch of times. It's my H index like crazy. Can I like cash that out somewhere?
You ready for tenure?
in fictitious land, yeah. No, but you're right. That's the thing, is that these things exist everywhere. They exist within institutions, right? There's all kind of arbitrary ways in which work performances is allied, you know. So it's not, again, it's a kind of shoot the messenger thing. Is I don't think confronting these things necessarily is a bad thing, but having them in front of you and being able to be like, okay, well, like which parts of this are useful, which parts of this could be absolutely completely.
So we can imagine some alternatives.
Yeah, that's the only way to do it. But imagining some kind of mythic. This is very not dissimilar, I think, to the kind of naivety when you think about the culture industry. You know, imagining that the culture industry was somehow always pure of these things is just naivety. That's just like inherited naivety, right? And so doing the same when it comes to metrics and evaluation of things is also just completely useless.
Let's take a trip back into history, right? You know, you're a musician in the 15th century. how do you earn your keep? Like, you need to know a king, or
totally.
and their daughter gets married, and you write the whatever.
Totally.
Like,
Which isn't to excuse it, but,
No, but just
let's not pretend.
Yeah, so like
It wasn't that way.
patronage has been happening in different ways. I suppose we have now models for distributed patronage,
Totally.
which some of us are using, but nothing that much has changed in terms of the kind of ultimate structure of that.
Yeah, I mean, like avant-garde. There's corners of avant-garde music that are like almost, like double-digit percentage funded by an Austrian princess. Nobody knows that because
I know the one you mean.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. Like, nobody, and good for her. I mean, like, I'm glad that money gets given to weird sound artists, right? But like, you don't read that in the press releases. That's not part of the official spiel of the culture industry. Like the culture industry, we have all lost our naivety, and there's benefits and there's doomer components to that, right? And then there's benefits to it where you're like, okay, now we're not naive anymore. We get to look at all these like this mess and then try and organize it into something hopefully better. I mean, there's going to be 10,000 different competing proposals for what that might look like, but we're in a far more advantageous position to grapple with those figures than pretending they don't exist, which is just ridiculous. It's not pragmatic at all.
Yeah. I just want to make a note that we are already 1 hour into our conversation. We were talking about a 5 minutes coffee break. How are you feeling? We can.
Yeah, I think
We take a little.
I have a final hot take about measurement.
Yes, please.
Which I will deliver in the coffee break. So this is to say that measurement and fungibility. I've been thinking lately about how measurement and fungibility are related, because introducing a measurement is actually the process of making something fungible. Which I don't know. I've just been thinking about that a lot. Like, we're taking two humans who we might think of as non-fungible, and now we're metricizing them with their follower counts.
Schrodinger's coin.
Yeah, so that's it. That's my final hot take about measurement.
That's sounding to ponder over. Like, yeah, like.
isn't there a great book about measurement? I'm just wondering if you might know it.
I can think of two. That one I read last year called Seeing Like a State. History of measurement a lot. And then I'm also reading Technic and Magic right now.
Yes.
Which is also actually about this problem in a lot of ways.
Seeing Like a State.
Yeah, but a lot of the great examples of like historical attempts to put measurements into place that did not really do what they were supposed to do come from Seeing Like a State.
Wow. All right, 5 minute break.
Yeah,
Right.
let's do it.
The sun came out, so we can actually. I might get some actual thing.
Cool.
Mm.
See you all in 5 minutes.
Go. So.
We're back. We're back after our little break. Is it a good time to do a scores check of? Oof.
Sarah's just killing us.
Sarah is a whale.
We're going
Compared to us.
to have to call you Sarah Friend with Benefits.
Oh no. I guess so. You know, knowing this information, I was a little skeptical of this financializing our panel.
It's
As
starting to look great now.
maybe, well, no, I want to say, and maybe it's my privilege to say this because I am currently the whale, but I'm not sure this is going to help have a productive discussion. Like,
Wasn't one of the questions that we're going to get to about adversariality? Like, I feel like this might
am I
be-
going to be attacked now? Wow.
DM me and I will announce your project on the stream.
Oh,
Yeah.
every clout has a silver lining, as they say.
That'll be the tokens for these plans.
Well, yeah, I guess one of the like goals or like aims of this experiment is precisely, I guess, for us. I mean, not that we are new to this world of like self metricizing and like putting ourselves on display in this kind of ways. But yeah, like I think I'm also personally quite wary of this kind of individualized metricizations. Which is something that again we see like.
But maybe it's inevitable. Like, I'm just thinking now about the quantified self movement, the Silicon Valley bros doing all this kind of like, microdosing so they can bang out more code or whatever it is. Like, maybe this is like another kind of symptom of these cultural trajectories that we see.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky. We just did a.
I think it's different to quantify yourself, but have those measurements known only to you than to be quantified publicly by others.
So then there's a political question: who is doing the quantifying?
Yeah.
Totally.
Well, definitely, and maybe this is the point to enter a question of access and exclusion, as we're thinking about who is doing the work. And yeah, I mean, we already touched on to like questions of access and exclusions. Like, and I had a few points or a few questions and reflections also coming from my work with Black Swan and like some of the things we've been thinking about a lot, particularly like looking at how a lot of the tokenized communities or social tokens that we see create like are communities that emerge around a token, are communities that oftentimes didn't really exist before these mechanisms were put into place. But then I think the questions become, or there's a different set of concerns to take into account when we're trying to apply these tools to communities that already exist. And, you know, again, groups of like creators, artists, and I guess, yeah, there's a lot of, I don't know, different sets of concerns. And the first one is, for me, the question of cognitive and economic barriers to entry into this system. Like, particularly if we're talking about blockchains, it's not very easy already to, you know, familiarize oneself with MetaMask, with like the different tools that are needed, like even understand exactly where the token's coming from, etc. If you're not already like, you know, initiated to this
There's
system.
an inherent asymmetry there. In favor
Yeah.
of the people that know how the things work, and that's very often the people that built them or designed them or developed them. And so, like, it's very hard to get away from that.
Well, exactly, and the question of an economic question becomes then also directly related to these, particularly as we're talking about using Ethereum as the main blockchain of a lot of the social tokens, and we know that Ethereum fees at the moment are like quite high, and yeah, so it's you know, how do you explain to someone that hasn't really that is not familiar with blockchains why they will need to spend, I don't know, the equivalent of $50 to sign a transaction to even get the tokens to participate to enter these kinds of communities. And yeah, I think, I don't know, there's these kinds of questions. There is the question of the open access of the content and like outputs that are produced by these communities. That is what often makes them like great. Versus what happens when you put a token at the entrance of these communities. So I don't know, these are more like I guess ongoing like live issues like for us. And yeah, I don't know if any of you has any recommendations or suggestions.
I have a devil's advocate position on this, just because it comes up a lot, and I think that like to state my priors or whatever, it's like, look, like access ultimately is a good thing. Nobody wants this to turn into like a country club, period, right? Like that's my like position on this.
Yeah.
However, I do think that like there's something truistic to like a lot of critiques that come in. There is kind of like there is a knee-jerk constant push to be like, well, is this accessible enough, right? But this kind of like a question that's become very fashionable. And I was starting thinking about it. And I was like, well, if you think like, in a sense, this is probably the most accessible rollout of an internet that's ever existed, right? Like the initial internet, there were all kind of attempts to make it accessible, but nobody even knew that an internet would be a thing to want to invest time into. So you needed a certain amount of pre-knowledge about it to want to take it seriously. And of course, the stuff there was like completely abstract to anyone without a computer science background. Web 2, you know, came out of like an open source community, but like the difference between like running an open source project, like even pre-GitHub, versus installing MetaMask is like leaps and bounds more accessible than that was. Not to mention the fact that like all those Web 2 projects that were incubated and ultimately mandated by a very small group of people, mostly in Silicon Valley, were not participatory at all in their inception, right? Like you didn't get to interact with it in any way, shape, or form. right? Now we live in a time, it's unfair to make a comparison because now we live in a time where you have the YouTubes of the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like, there is an argument to suggest that this is exactly the most accessible world out of the web there's ever been. Now, of course, when you do that, what's kind of paradoxical about it is that, again, when you have the future shock of confronting people all of a sudden with a lot of alien interactions and concepts they haven't previously encountered, and you say, here, look at that, in a weird way, paradoxically, you can feel more excluded from something that is happening than if you didn't know it was happening in the first place. So weirdly, accessibility paradoxically can create feelings of more exclusion than non-accessibility, right?
Maybe there's like a financial inclusion, exclusion access, and a technical inclusion, exclusion access, and we're kind of trading off between these two things.
Exactly. And I only say this because one of my bugbears, because a lot of times it's like it's become this kind of truistic, very like centrist liberal position to take, where you're like, think about accessibility, and oftentimes when people do that, you know, there is often like a conflation, as you said, between financial access and technical access. There's a lot of really technical people in the world who aren't very wealthy, right? And I get annoyed about this because of this assumption that the only people that understand this stuff are the wealthy. And I'm like, no, like there's more engineers in India than there probably are people in Germany or something like that. Don't quote me on that. But like, but there are. I mean, there's a lot of very, very technically adept people who do not have wealth, material wealth. And so sometimes I feel like the sometimes condescend people, because there's a lot of people who, you know, for example, aren't like middle class artists or whatever, who see emergent things and they say, well, no, this is worth me putting my time into because I see that this is going to impact my life, my family's life, my community's life, and I have the capability to try and to hunker down and like try to understand this stuff, right? So accessibility, I think, often gets reduced down to these kind of, you know, to conversations amongst people who generally are quite well off, and I feel that actually, you know, people who aren't well off often get condescended too.
I feel like there's two extremes on the side that I want to hear from Sarah on the circle side with inclusion for obvious reasons, but I also just wanted to mention that I had a previous project where I was banging the drum for Bitcoin as a tool to liberate against against political oppression, basically, to empower people in the most straitened of circumstances. Now, you know, the transaction fees went up, and then, you know, little Timmy in the mountains of Afghanistan can't do that anymore. Yeah. But there was this emancipatory promise in the early days of a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
And there's kind of the financialization of a lot of these networks. First Bitcoin, now Ethereum, is pushing out a lot of the non-financial use cases. Yeah. And so like the financial exclusion barrier is getting more stringent, even if the technical one is falling.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking from a circles perspective and to like a very practical response to your initial question, Laura, this is an issue for circles. Absolutely. We felt that the full onboarding ramp to crypto participation was too much for the user we wanted to target. So we put a technical solution in place. We pay people's transaction fees. Do we run on Ethereum? No, we cannot afford to run on Ethereum. We run on XDAI. And we we have a relayer service. So users pay us in Circles token. It's symbolic at this point, but there's a promise, I suppose, if the project ever became monetized against fiat sufficiently, that relayer might be sustainable financially. So that's what Circles chose to do. I guess that's not for every project, but if it's like really, really important that you make this crypto on-ramp easier, I think that's one of the better ways to do it.
So you can access everything through the web browser on your mobile.
Yeah, and it's great, like, subsidizing fees. It's almost some kind of like welfare function that the new Web3 institutions would need to eventually like embrace that or like begin considering, I think.
Sure. UBI for your UBI.
Exactly. Luckily, the fees on XDAI are low enough that it's in around $100 for an estimated year. So it's very, very low.
But that comes at the price of permissionlessness, you could argue.
It does. And I think that projects have to consider what their adversary is. And for Circles, we considered that probably no one really, you know, the
people
the decentralization stats and parameters of the XDAI network were probably fine for the type of project that we were rolling out.
Yeah.
It's a question of priorities.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's a trade-off, right? And you see a similar thing where it's like conversations around, gas fees inherent to minting an NFT or gas fees inherent to participate with Ethereum. And it's like, well, no, the easiest thing to do is like be more like Flow. And you're like, well, there's trade-offs there, right? Because like in the short term, if your focus is on these specific fees, right? And like the throughput or whatever. And you're like, yeah, but then there's considerations of decentralization, there's considerations of censorship resistance and all these kind of things that like in the short term, if you're not super well educated in the space, you might think, oh, well, we just do it on Tezos, you know? And you're like, well, actually, when you make that decision, you might be opening up more problems than you thought, because it's going to be easier to mint your NFT, but you know, what happens X, Y, Z? And it's like, and the great bet I assume that everyone's making, I mean, I think, again, it's a really complicated conversation. It's complicated in some dynamics to such an extent that I don't think I fully have a position on it yet, because because there's a lot to consider. But it's like, you know, I act in this space a little bit under the assumption that some of the issues with like gas barriers will be resolved. And if they aren't resolved, then that is enough of a competitive disadvantage to see other chains emerge that will have solved that problem, right? Or address that problem. So it's like, you kind of have to suspend judgment. I'm suspending judgment a little bit when I talk about this stuff hypothetically, because I'm saying, look, I just assume that over the next 5 years, like, you know,
Everything's still an experiment here.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, there's still like new kind of gas mitigation proposals being implemented. People are doing things off the base chain. Like we talk about layer 2 as things that happen kind of off the chain that settle later in batches to save those transaction fees, to save that precious real estate in the blockchain. So there's many different approaches being tried. Things that go outside proof of work. Ethereum is meant to go to proof of stake. I've been waiting for 7 years for that. So like, I hope it comes.
Which feels like a long time in crypto, but again, when you're thinking about like the broader scope or the ambition of the network, 7 years is nothing, right? Like, I mean, so we'll see. But yeah, exactly. This is where we start getting into belief, you know, like fundamentally.
Yeah, but maybe again on the question of like how to onboard people, or like how to onboard these existing communities onto in this new space. So like maybe that's the right question of like how do you maybe gamify that kind of onboarding and make it, you know, fun or interesting, at least to try out and, you know, like learn something along the way, like and open up this new space. That's maybe something that like to think about before, like I don't know, social incentives rather than on-chain kind of
totally.
mechanisms could be a way of looking at it as well.
Well, like referral schemes have existed since time immemorial, right? And they all kind of look like pyramids as well. So let's try to imagine a bit better.
Yeah.
I think, again, I still think the ownership meme will be the onboarding mechanism for better or worse. That meme will endure, and it's like, this is more coming from like music native kind of universe. I'm like, equity was the one, I've been shouting this for years, but it's like, equity was the one kind of meme that could be pushed that can't be pushed by the centralized powers that come to dominate Web 2. It's the one thing they cannot offer. It's the one thing they can't like tie into their service.
They can offer you a fake version of it. So I heard this week that Robinhood is planning to build a platform which will democratize access to early stage investing. Previously only open to accredited investors, blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
I'm like, well, but they are doing it.
Yeah, sure.
So who are they?
Yeah. So it's like the coinless model, but with, okay.
Definitely.
Um,
I have a note from our stream direction that says that there is a campaign in the chat to balance out the scores. So very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds like we're going around in circles.
Let's just like Sarah won, and then this is our attempt to make it more simple.
Now we move into the utopian imaginary.
Exactly. Exactly. We want such outcomes here, please.
I have a couple comments about accessibility. One of them is I really appreciated the disentangling of the financial cost of participating in the network from the technical inaccessibility of you know, diving into the project of creating smart contracts. But I think there's also actually another inaccessibility or terrain for accessibility, which is financial literacy, which is very real and also very inaccessible. A type of technical knowledge that is not software related necessarily. And I guess a second kind of point is like, I do think though, you know, the in terms of the technical accessibility of Web 3 versus Web 2 versus like Web 1, I think that the complexity of the tech stack required to get started with a Web 3 project is actually, like, to build it, to DIY it, is actually significantly bigger than the complexity to build a project that is not a Web3 project. Like in the early days of, I've talked about this a lot with Ruth from Broomfield, who I think spoke yesterday. You know, in the early days of web art, right-click view source was a really, really like accessible way to learn about what was going on inside the websites you were using. And that is like not available. Like the right-click view source of Ethereum is like a big hex string on Etherscan, you know?
This reminds me of a concept that I think it was Tim Roughgarden wrote a paper about. It's basically about packet routing in networks, but in a very general sense, and it's called the price of anarchy. And you're kind of comparing having a totally P2P bottom-up emergent system versus having a centralized top-down, everything's directed. And like the price is the difference that you pay for that inefficiency. And again, we can talk about that price in financial terms and in technical terms. I think that very much speaks to what Sarah's intimating.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it's also an unfair comparison. The only point being is just saying, of course, in that period of time, you wouldn't then be able to go on YouTube and find 16 people to like who maybe had addressed that question or something like this. It's like it's a really difficult thing to calculate, but in terms of accessibility, we are seeing basically the beginning stages of a new internet happening in real time, where you can actually access those people, and a lot of them do publish, and a lot of them are but it's really difficult to compare different epochs in that way, or unfair to the previous ones.
Yeah, and the question of financial literacy is it's really important. Like we were talking about equity, but I guess so there's like quite a bit of equity has become this like nebulous or like meme. The real equity is probably something that we don't get Web 2.0 Web 2 companies like giving equity to their users because they literally couldn't by law. So in this space, there is this.
So you have to disentangle equity from equitability.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, I didn't realize this recently. I was listening to something recently, and they were saying that like equity is in like amongst the Democratic Party becoming like a huge word politically. Like I've completely missed this. But of course, then I'm going on Twitter using it as meaning like, no, you have an ownership share in a project that specifically that you can cash out at some point. And somebody could be reading that and being like, oh yeah, like Kamala Harris is talking about them. Like I have no idea what Kamala Harris is talking about. But allegedly that word is trending right now. Like that's the thing.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, I guess so. No, I think the financial literacy is also a big point for me. Is like for better and worse. Like I do not come from a particularly financially literate background, and the crash course in this world has like been incredibly educational to me, for better and worse. Like just in understanding the movement of money, and also being grossed out by like in some cases how simple it can be for people to make a whole ton of money. Like I feel that has been a gift of my interest and participation in this space, is all of a sudden being like, oh yeah, now things make more sense.
You see how it is.
Yeah, because you aren't given this training. I mean, and you could say the same for technical training, right? Like it's not just an age thing, by the way, because like I have a brother who's 10 years younger than me who was not taught financial literacy in school, was not taught like to program in school, was not, so these are real problems. And this space I think has contributed to knowledge about that for better and worse.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
And maybe since they're gonna cut us off in 20 minutes,
I
know. Like taking the question of equity versus equitability to maybe open out the question of community versus public interest. And so is there any potential of these technologies to create some alignments between communities and public interest? And this was more something that I thought, particularly in relation to what Sim, since he's very knowledgeable about attack vectors and exactly what are the dynamics in the space. Like, how does the adversarial mindset of a lot of these protocols play into relations between token-based communities and a larger public interest that is outside of this?
I mean, I suppose we should call back to the institution-execution thing we were talking about before, where we kind of can see then there's kind of these boundaries to these networks of networks, or these tribes, or these cryptocurrencies, or blockchain networks, or whatever you want to say. And I would also say that hard baked into almost every cryptocurrency project by virtue of its like common genesis from Bitcoin, you have this kind of zero-sum mindset by putting markets at the place of everything. So markets are a conversation between buyers and sellers, and there's like winners and losers from that, and like it next to zero or close enough to zero. And I do wonder sometimes if by building these networks with the zero-sum mindset at its heart, at least economically, you get these kind of socio-political penumbras of this zero-sum mindset. Yeah. And I critiqued this quite voraciously recently with respect to Bitcoin, which I regard as a new form of cryptographic necroprimitivism, where it's easier to imagine the heat death of the universe than it is to replace proof of work. Everyone is sufficiently incentivized that they cannot imagine, they refuse to imagine an alternative.
Have you considered gas flares also?
Well, speaking of that, people mine Bitcoin using the waste gas from fracking wells, and they say that's helping now. Yeah. But then that might actually mean more people frack more so that they can get more of this waste gas to mine Bitcoin. And there was recently an article in The Independent which caused some furore, but it's nothing new. Somebody hooked up an oil well directly to a Bitcoin mine. Directly to it. So like, no, there's not even like sense of abstraction between like the energy source and the use. Just plug them in together. And the point of going back to the ecological externalities is that Bitcoin doesn't have a sophisticated sensing mechanism. Neither do most proof of work networks. So rather than it being a good or a bad moral argument, they just can't care about their externalities. Yeah. And that's one of the common problems with everything having this origin from Bitcoin is that we have this culture of not caring. I remember something that somebody at Trust said about events that used to happen here before I showed up, which was that when there were events that were regarding P2P, peer-to-peer technology, people would always clean up afterwards, put the chairs away, put things in the trash. And when there were blockchain events, the place was a complete mess. And so like read into that what you will.
And I believe I'll add the detail of the blockchain people did not put the €1 in the beer donation jar when they took the beers from the fridge.
Because there's no QR code.
The person I heard that story from is in this room.
Oh, this protocol isn't algorithmically enforced. Oops.
It's also an issue too. Like I was chatting on a working group with Jaya Brecker recently, who is great, and this was one issue that came up. Ruth was there too, actually, with Catlow from Furtherfield, and this is one issue that comes up too, where it's kind of like you have an asymmetry of time, where it's like a lot of the people who are working the most on some of the space are also insanely busy. There's a lot of activity happening. They tend to be like inwardly focused, right? There is, and so in many cases, I think when you're thinking about like the application of some of these things to public goods, there is a lot of potential there to think, and these are things that should be deliberated. You see the same challenge with AI, right? It's just like there are these powerful tools that you can use. I think that any commonsensical reading is don't just like let them run amok in the real world, because they're not, there's a great deal of responsibility that will come with that. But there are some applications where they could indeed help, right? And so we were talking, you were talking about like quadratic voting. We were chatting to Audrey Tang on the podcast recently from Taiwan, and she was talking about how like quadratic voting is being implemented in certain cases related to the dissemination of public funds. I can see that, we were I was talking to a group yesterday about like, in the States, people thinking about Europe, and they're like, oh, well, Europe is this utopia where everyone gets funds for their art projects. And you're like, well, there's, you might think that, but then actually you get here, and I love the fact that the state does apportion funds toward public stuff, but in actuality, those are very centrally controlled.
And there's a metagame going on.
Yeah, totally. And there's entrenched power, there's entrenched concentrated power that keeps getting the same grants over and over again. And then the person who's running it is like, in their 60s, and like they don't get the new project from the 21-year-old that would be really cool. And actually, these are mechanisms when you talk about like matching funds through quadratic voting, etc., like Gitcoin grants have been running. You can see really kind of low risk kind of ways in which these mechanisms can be deployed for the public good, to allow for more people to participate in where funds go, in a more democratic fashion than currently exists in democracies that we have, right?
You can mitigate a lot of the attack vectors if you know who the participants are. So if it's in Taiwan, everyone's voting, we know who they are. In the Black Swan working group, we knew who everybody was. Exactly. But if you have a system that's open, like the Gitcoin one, then you don't have that
Yeah.
necessarily,
Yeah.
and then that's where the problems come with the
Exactly.
civil attacks, people sock pocketing and so on.
Totally.
Yeah.
But the point is that there's not a lot of time spent on those particular issues, and there could be, and that's important work because these things could be quite useful. You know?
Yeah, and there is perhaps also like I don't know, within the crypto space, quite of a limited understanding of the concept of public good. Like again, everything is an experiment. Things are really early on, so all these experiments need to be celebrated, I think, more than anything. But it's something that we've been thinking about with Toby and Sam, Toby Shorin and Sam Hart, with the other internet. We're starting to think or to grapple with the question of public and public goods and public funding in this space. Obviously, I guess on the internet per se, there is not really a public space that could define as such, or there's like a
It's more
user
like a
base.
club. It's more like the clubs of the different gradations, I suppose.
Yeah. And so, like, I guess thinking about how to support, how to interface, or how to even conceive of a public that is not just the user or the holder of your tokens. It's already, a challenge or like a exercise of the imagination to open that up a little bit. Like, would be really interesting, I think, to put together, I don't know, DeFi, decentralized finance, and all these like yield farming protocols and see what happens. The moment in which someone really begins offering a service to perhaps, leave like part of your yield or route part of your yield to the support of the development of projects that can be considered public. I think there's like interesting things to be played out there. But
I noticed we've only got a few minutes left, and we haven't talked about BitClout, which I think is very much the story of the day. I feel like we should at least reference it with this with regards to this. So shall I just say really briefly what BitClout is? So BitClout is a kind of a pseudo social network that some people have built, and it's each person on the website has a profile. Whether they put it there or not is another matter. And I know some people in this room have profiles there that they didn't put on there. And then each profile has a particular coin attached to it, and you can buy that coin. Even if you're the person, you're kind of expected to buy the coin with Bitcoin. And some people got airdropped this stuff, and there were some VCs and investors that were kind of had a head start before this thing went public and already have their pockets full. And so they put, for better or worse, a bunch of the prominent lawyers in the crypto space, regulators in the crypto space, preloaded their profiles onto this website, gave them a market value and all this kind of stuff. And then the takedown letters have already started appearing and so on. So it's very interesting. I'm so curious to hear your thoughts on BitClout.
Sarah?
I'll start. I discovered I was on there. And I suspect I'm probably not the only person in this room who is, but you have to join to find out. So there was someone who was posting a thread where they had joined and they were willing to check if you were on there for you. So that's how I found out.
Shout out to James Prestwich for doing a lot of that digging.
Yeah, I didn't get help from
Right.
him, but someone doing the same thing. I guess, what really surprised me is the physical feeling of being nauseated when I saw my own profile. It felt like actually like a pretty big violation to have my photo, bio, and name up there,
As if you wanted to be there.
non-consensually being used to sell something.
Yeah.
I didn't expect to have the visceral reaction to it that I did. Yeah.
I don't want to check that.
I think a lot of people have that reaction. If you go by just from the Bitcoin sphere of the Twitter world, I was following the story at 2 a.m. one night this week, and there was a lot of this similar level of horror.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to something about the boundaries of what's acceptable.
Yeah, totally.
Like you're being tokenized against your will here.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like a hybrid of like kind of domain squatting, right? Like that kind of happened before where it's like, I'm going to buy Madonna.com because Madonna's going to do this.
Go to the moon.
Yeah, exactly. But then you do it, as a network. And so you get, rather than buying your domain, your participation is already giving them their returns. It's it's gross. It's annoying to me. Like, yeah, projects like this are like, it's an idea that, to be honest, I had heard probably 100 times. Or this like low hanging fruit of like, oh, you could do this thing, and that wouldn't that suck, and like get a lot of people really mad, you know, and like someone did it, and you're like, oh, really? Like, is that like, why are you wasting?
It wasn't just somebody did it; somebody that was backed by some of the biggest VCs in this in the crypto space.
The shocking thing about BitClout is how many people that must have gone through who were like, yeah, this is a good thing to spend our time and energy doing.
Totally.
Like.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's almost good that it happened and you receive such a big backlash because
But the backlash also created attention, which also goes for better words. So a lot of people have sent Bitcoin to BitClout.
Yeah,
you can follow that on the blockchain. It's a lot of money. I can't remember the figures right now. You can all look them up. It's a lot of money. Yeah. So this thing actually worked. This visceral feeling and the reaction, the kind of immune response online has actually worked in their favor as well.
Well, totally, because then you also get the FOMO component where it's like there is. I mean, this is like part of the doomer scenario. Like, it reminds me. I mean, like 2017, like ICO craziness, where like I remember joking afterwards that like had I like invested in everything that made me nauseous, I probably would be in like on the beach right now, you know, because like literally like 1-to-1, like everything where I was like, that's disgusting. Like, you should not do that. Yeah, people jump in. Yeah, but life's too short, you know. Life's too short. Like, it's just such it's just such an obvious, like an obviously bad caricature of an idea. I get, yeah, but I hope there are some reputational repercussions too.
I've seen lawyer letters that are going around on Twitter. Like, it seems like repercussions are like imminent.
Because there are other ways that you could do that in the sense, right? Like, there are ways where you can, like, rather than allowing people to speculate on things in advance. I've seen this with like ETH domains, for example, like in ENS, there are people who've like reserved domains for people and are like, oh, hey, like, if you want this, I was holding on to this for you. Like, there's all kind of like benevolent ways that you could somehow like mark someone's place in a system and say, okay, like, and protect them and fortify them against speculation on their identity.
Ethical squatting.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I mean, that happens with like IP squatting, right? In some cases, like, you claim the IP so that someone can't afford it.
It's defensive. Right? This is defensive IP strategies, right?
Exactly. And like, so it's not necessarily a bad thing to preempt that actually something might be valuable to somebody, but to then do it and then like, yeah, like speculate on their reputation before they, you know, that's like.
You would have to. Oh, you had to pay to contact their support as well. You had to buy.
You're joking, really?
You had to pay Bitcoin to buy BitClout to contact their support.
So it's basically like WannaCry or something. I mean, it's like it's ransomware.
Yeah, they're building
ransomware.
Multiple social graphs out of it as well.
Yeah, so it's ransomware.
One thing that's kind of interesting is I remember, and I don't remember the name of the company, but there was a similar controversy about an AI startup just a couple months ago, I feel, who had scraped all the photos from Twitter.
The Australian guy, right?
Don't remember, but done something similarly, non-consensually scraped social media data and was using it, I think, to train facial recognition. And there was an outcry about it, but it had a different character. And I almost wonder if we're irritated by BitClout just because we know. Yeah, I guess this is to say that who knows how many people have scraped our photos and Twitter bios and used them internally.
Yeah, and the ethics of that stuff hasn't been worked out. I remember that project, and it was like they were selling like basically just like private data sets of categorized things. I mean, it's weird. Like, I'm married to someone who's a semi-public figure. Amazon has record of her where you can hit at certain Amazon APIs and get that clip. So like the new OpenAI project right now like has her as an archetype. Wow. So you can generate her in certain cases, right? And all of this was done non-consensually.
You married to an avatar, Matt.
Yeah, well, somewhat. No, but I mean, but all of this was non-consensual, and it's like, and it's you know, again, Wikipedia was also non-consensual, so it's a difficult thing, but there's clearly wrong, like taking the ransomware approach.
Yeah, it's almost institutionalized ransomware and comes out to be cloud.
Yeah.
And weaponized as well. So the latest seems to be that the backers, the deep-pocketed backers, are inching away from this project, trying to minimize their tarnishing with the reputational storm that's coming with this thing. But the big question is like, how did it get to this stage? Right? They must have obviously been willing this thing, and now it's launched. This is kind of like their exit moment. So they're trying to get away with their gains.
But it makes sense. I mean, I remember a lot of ideas circulating a few years ago where it also fits very much into a dynamic I haven't seen emerge, but I feel is very native to the kind of crypto libertarian space, which is the bounty, right? Where like I remember there being ideas floating around for a period of time where it was like, we want to see, which I don't think is a terrible idea per se, but it's like, we really want to see these two public figures debate. So what we're going to do is we're going to like put a bunch of ETH in wallets that can be unlocked once they agree to participate in this tournament that we have set up for them, you know?
Blockchain deathmatch.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, but it's like those like kind of bounty dynamics of being like, how do we make it so tempting for you to want to unlock the BitClout account? That feels like an idea that's not new to the space. It's just kind of like maybe this is one of the shittiest ways.
I see this in regulated projects that are being developed now, some of which I work on, where we're working on systems that people are trying to incentivize people from outside their network or institution or whatever you want to say to bring something in. Could be information or something like that. And then you have the question of like, then you have political questions and the economic questions and, you know, the asymmetry with literacy and all the rest. And I haven't seen a good way to do it yet.
Yeah.
Which is a problem because I it has to build one. I don't know how to do it. Like all the options are bad. Yeah, they were bad.
Yeah, we had a question from before. Would you hold friends with benefits tokens if they produce public goods?
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that stuff's interesting. I mean, again, a lot of that stuff, like, you're going to need humans to verify. And I think actually Circles has been one of the experiments that I think has been most interesting for that. Like, this kind of like, it's almost kind of like key exchange, key signing, kind of like human verification system. You can see systems like that being used in a non-crazy way to verify off-chain activity that happens. And you could imagine there being some kind of a social or community tokenized community that can verify that stuff and then reward people back there with that kind of like human interface layer built in for certain public goods. I would love to see that stuff. I mean, it's just it's as I said, but it's just about finding like something that would be quantifiable enough that you could like actually say that this has made a difference in what it's doing. But I think the Gitcoin grants, we're also seeing a lot of DAOs, for example, that I think are going to start like opening up, like, you know, trying to fund things that you will be able to vote on you know, and so more of those projects sound really cool.
Yeah.
Just doing them, you know.
It's hard. I mean, like Black Swan will speak to this as well. Like, you know, Black Swan is kind of a pseudo DAO project as well. So like, and that's something for later.
No, absolutely. And we have 1 minute left. I think this is the
Hey.
read the scores.
Damn.
Whoa.
Sarah's still winning.
Really? Thank you to my supporters.
Like and subscribe. This is after the attempt for everyone to rebalance it, so heaven knows how much Sarah would have won by.
You already have 1 minute. But yeah. Like there's nothing what seeing you and I are like high.
I mean, it looks cool.
Oh, actually, not anymore.
To paraphrase, there is no clout, only other people's egos.
Very nice. And well, thank you all very much for participating and having this conversation. It's been really fun.
Thanks, Dara.
Yeah, and well, thank you, Trust. Thank you, Arthur and GBN.
Stuff to trust.
Yeah.
More of this.
Yeah.
Like and subscribe.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And thank you, MoneyLab, of course.
Thanks, MoneyLab.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers,
and-
MoneyLab. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stay safe out there.
You too.